So Ian, I thought it would be great to start with a quote that I've heard you recite before, and a quote that probably, if Einstein were alive today, may have written a blurb to go on the front of your book, because it seems to describe perfectly what your book's all about. And the quote is, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant." And the question you ask is, have we lost sight of the sacred gift, or have we lost our way with that? It seemed to be a very good and very, very brief summary of what the Master and its Mystery is all about.
Well, yes, and what Einstein is supposed to have gone on to say is that we honour the servant, the reason, but we've forgotten the gift of intuition. And in the book that I'm writing at the moment, I do talk a lot more about reason and intuition head on. What are they useful for? And of course, they're both incredibly important. And my message is certainly nothing to do with that we should stop being rational beings. I think we're being extremely irrational and unreasonable beings by over-trusting a kind of very narrow, mechanistic rationalizing about everything in a way that in the past would never have been thought appropriate. I mean, one sees it in daily life in the way in which things like medical practice or a school, a university, are run according to principles increasingly that are only those of an accountant. They're not those which are harder to specify, more intangible, less measurable, but are nonetheless the really important things in medicine, in teaching, in learning. So I think I started that book really from reflecting what the heck is going on in our world, and why is it that we seem to be confronted with so many paradoxes? Why is it that we, for example, prize security so much that we end up going into regions of the world and causing chaos, which results in a huge escalation of danger for everybody? Why do we so worry about bacteria in our daily life that we produce people who are extremely vulnerable to infection, and so on and so forth?
Yeah.
And they're everywhere you look. And part of this is to do with this inability to understand things that are implicit. Perhaps I ought to go back a bit to where I was when I made the decision to study medicine.
Yeah.
Because I was 28 and I'd been an academic in Oxford, mainly interested in the area of philosophy and literature. And I got very interested in the mind-body problem for reasons to do with the study of literature. It struck me that there was a poem, there was something that was somebody had taken trouble in the past to write, to communicate something, and it was absolutely unique. If it hadn't existed, you couldn't have invented it any more than you could have thought of your closest friend if you'd never met that friend.
Yeah.
And it was also embodied in the very words that it was in. If you paraphrased it, it just became a handful of dust. And it was utterly implicit. You know, as soon as you made it explicit, you ruined it.
Yeah.
And then what did you do with it? You got a lot of clever people together in a seminar room, and you turned this unique, embodied, implicit thing into something general, abstract, and explicit.
Yeah.
And to cut a long story short, it struck me that there was a problem with our thinking in very much like brains in vats about things out there that were objects that didn't have any kind of embodied reality for us.
Yeah.
And that interested me in what was going on in our brains. And so I studied medicine, and I was very inspired by Oliver Sacks, actually, to do this, his writing, and principally Awakenings, an extraordinary book. And to see what happened, because that book shows what happens when something goes wrong with somebody's brain and it affects their whole world, or something goes wrong in their mind and it affects their body.
Yeah.
So these things are deeply, closely connected. So I studied medicine and went off into neurology and psychiatry, which is the area of overlap. And it was there that I started to ask myself the question, why is the brain divided? You know, in medical school, it was never, I mean, obviously it was mentioned, there it was, we looked at it in dissection and so on, but nobody said, and the reason that this thing is in two halves like this, nobody knew, and nobody even asked the question. And then later, for reasons I probably won't go into in detail now, I learned that the two hemispheres have completely different ways of looking at the world.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of nonsense talked about hemisphere difference that put serious scientists off the topic altogether. I was told, don't even touch this topic because it's career death. It's top psychology, it doesn't have any basis. And yet, when one came to look at scholarly research on people who'd had damage to one or other hemisphere, you could see that they had completely different effects, depending on whether it was the left or the right hemisphere.
Yeah.
And that was being overlooked and ignored. People say, oh, there aren't any really serious differences. But I think what they were doing wrong was they were thinking of the brain as a machine. And so they were asking the question you'd ask of a machine, what does it do?
Yeah.
And they said, first of all, well, the left does reason and language, and the right does emotion and pictures. And then they found that this was completely untrue, because each hemisphere got involved in all those things.
Yeah.
But what they didn't seem to be asking was the question you'd ask of part of a person, which is how, in what way does each hemisphere get involved in these things? And if you do that, you find that each hemisphere is involved in reason, language, emotion, visuospatial things, all the rest, every single thing that makes up parts of our lives, just with a completely different take on it.
Yeah.
That was the difference.
Yeah.
And to begin with, I couldn't quite see how staggeringly important this was. And then I realised the two halves of the brain are attending to the world in two different ways. And we know that when you attend differently, you see different things. There are lots of clever demonstrations, some of them by Derren Brown and illusionists and so on, which show, and have gone into popular culture, where, you know, if you're not expecting to see something, you don't see it. If you look with a certain kind of attention, you see one thing. If you look with another kind of attention, you see something completely different.
Yeah.
And quite apart from those clever illustrations, in our daily life, when we look at things with a certain kind of attention, we find a different kind of world from what is apparently the same world on a different day when we're attending to it differently.
When did that come to you? Was it just a moment of inspiration, or was it a dissatisfaction with the explanation that the traditional view of the left and right brain was given?
I mean, really what happened was that I heard a lecture by a man called John Cutting, who I consider the most interesting living psychiatrist. And he had done what no other physician had been doing, which was looking at what happened after right hemisphere strokes. Everyone was focused on left hemisphere strokes. And they thought, well, nothing serious happens to somebody with a right hemisphere stroke, because they can still use their right hand, their language is usually unimpaired. But actually, it turns out that they're much more seriously impaired and harder to rehabilitate after a right hemisphere stroke than after a left hemisphere stroke, even though after a left hemisphere stroke it's very probable that you won't be able to speak and you won't be able to use your right hand. Now that surprises people.
Yeah.
But what John was saying is, when the left hemisphere is damaged, you see these very obvious results. But when the right hemisphere is damaged, what you don't immediately see is that their whole experience of the world has changed.
Yeah.
And he alerted me to some things in this lecture which rang a bell, because he said the left hemisphere fails to understand implicit meaning. It doesn't understand metaphor, jokes, irony, sense of humour. It takes things very literally, in a sort of mechanical way. It is less in touch with the body than the right hemisphere. And literally the body image, which is not just a visual image, but an image in all senses in the brain of ourselves as embodied beings, is in the right hemisphere. And he was saying also that the general ideas, as it were, get collected abstractly in the left hemisphere, but unique instances, embodied concrete instances of things, are better appreciated by the right hemisphere. And at one go, he had just told me something I'd been puzzling about for years, which was, clearly, the reason I'd found it so difficult to explain in the first book I wrote, which was called Against Criticism, was my problem with what we were doing to works of literature in the university, was that the reason it was hard to explain was that it's the left hemisphere that does the talking. It's my left hemisphere now that is speaking to you.
Yeah.
And it has set up a kind of language that works well for it. But it's much harder to convey the meanings and knowledge that the right hemisphere has.
Yeah.
That often, when you make something explicit, you utterly change its nature. You can see this with sex. You can see it with religion. You can see it with jokes. You can see it with poems. You know, and that when you disembody something, you utterly change its reality for us and how we relate to it.
Yeah.
And that when you abstract and generalize something, you've completely lost what was unique and special about it.
Yeah. And I suppose the longer and the more precise you think you're becoming, in fact, the further away you could be actually heading.
Well, that's right. And you're doing a rather paradoxical thing, is you're destroying the thing that you're trying to examine in the process of examining it.
Yeah.
And very often, I think, what we as a society have been tending to do in the last 150 years is increasingly to denature the world by our way of talking about it abstractly, mechanically, reductively, and that we have not attended to, because it's harder to see, what has been lost, and what, as it were, the part of us that understands the implicit knows.
Yeah.
Now, the implicit is enormous compared with the explicit. The bit that we actually see explicitly in the center of our focus of consciousness is minute. It's conservatively estimated to be much less than 5% of all the stuff that we're knowing and experiencing.
Yeah.
And probably it's very, very much less than that.
Yeah.
So the unconscious mind, which includes the whole of our bodies as well as the other parts of the brain and so forth, is taking in, dealing with, assessing and responding to the world, knowing things, as it were, that in our explicit conscious minds we've ruled out.
Yeah.
We don't talk about them, and we've said we don't believe in them.
Yeah.
So that actually skews the picture of what the world is, who we are, and how we relate.
Yeah. But for this to be the case, it must be true then that there was a time when it was very useful for us to rely on this left brain dominance.
Absolutely.
And therefore we did more of it, and it became a habit. It became a habit we haven't been able to break, and it's one that is leading us, into the world, what's led us into the world we have today.
Yes.
So how did we lose? How did we lose the balance? Because if we'd become so dominant, how did that take place?
That's a very interesting and difficult question to answer, and I don't think I've got a simple answer. But what I can say is that in the second half of my book, The Master and His Emissary, I look at the course of Western civilization through the lens of what we know about these societies in terms of the emphasis that might be laid on what the right hemisphere can see and what the left hemisphere can see. And 3 times at the Greek, the Roman, and our own civilization, starting at the Renaissance, began with an incredibly fruitful harmony and marriage of these 2 ways of being and thinking.
Yeah.
In other words, the left and right working together as they should do. But over time, in each case, not just in our own case, what I would call the take of the left hemisphere solidified, fossilized, and became the normal way of thinking. And as a result, each of those civilizations collapsed.
Yeah.
And when they collapsed, a lot of people would say they were absent for about 1,000 years. Well, we haven't got 1,000 years.
No.
So
No, and so this is the point we're at, perhaps, where we have this, society with the pursuit of happiness leading to people being dissatisfied often, or feeling like maybe the next thing to come is just around the corner. So there's a yearning, often, or the quest for freedom. Wanting to be free all the time, but then being completely paranoid about security, or are we safe?
Well, ending up being more surveyed and monitored and spied on than any society since time began. Exactly,
in all ways, probably from walking in busy cities where everything's followed, or even online where it seems that's the case too.
Yes.
So
soon, no doubt, we'll have little chips in us. The state will insist on these so that it can track in our own interests, so that if we get lost or hurt, be able to find us.
So how might we break that cycle of feeling like the pursuit of happiness is something that we need to drive towards with that left brain dominance all the time of lists of things we must do or things that we have to...
Well, the first thing to do is to understand what we're doing wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, as a psychiatrist, I know it's no good telling people what they must do. I often know quite soon after meeting them that it would be a very good idea if they did several things.
Yeah.
But it's no good to say that.
Yeah.
What you first need to do is to get people to the point where they see for themselves that what they're doing is not working and why.
So you need to create the right conditions for that to be clear.
Well, what I need to do is raise consciousness, and that's what I can't myself do very much. I'm a single person nearing the end of his life, so I don't claim and can't to have solutions.
Yeah.
But what I can do is to open people's eyes to what's going on and how they're actually being deceived into... They're being palmed off, really, with a very, very sad, dwarfed, impoverished version of life, of the world, compared with one we could have and that people in other cultures possibly still do to an extent, although they're becoming westernized much too fast.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with Western culture. Western culture has many things to be proud of. But it's always about getting this balance between the right and left, right? And when I say balance, they need to work together, but the right hemisphere needs to be the one that, as it were, oversees the picture.
Yeah.
Because literally it sees the bigger picture.
Yes.
Literally, the left hemisphere has a narrow beam focus of attention. It's like a high-resolution lens that is looking around and picking up details, and then wondering, how do I put all that together?
Yeah.
Whereas the right hemisphere, literally, its attention is broad and sustained over time.
Yeah.
And it so therefore sees a bigger picture. It also actually is, interestingly, quite clearly more intelligent.
Yeah.
So, there's been some very interesting research done recently on what happens to people after damage to parts of the brain in terms of their IQ.
Yeah.
And a lot of people might assume, well, the left hemisphere, it may have its problems, but it does all that sort of number crunching. Actually, a lot of the intelligent part of maths is to do with seeing analogies with pattern recognition, and goes on in the right hemisphere. And actually I'm writing about that at the moment. I mean, most great mathematicians and scientists, indeed, when describing their discoveries, don't describe a linear process.
Yeah.
They describe an insight, which then, Einstein being another example.
It sounds very similar to music when you're describing that to me as well, the mathematics of tone or the mathematics of sequences of notes.
Yes.
It sounds like a very similar idea where, the great mathematicians see things as, the beauty in the patterns rather than the numbers themselves and the complexity of the math.
And beauty is a good word because, in fact, extraordinarily frequently scientists, highly imaginative scientists, I'm not talking about just everyone who works in the lab, but the people who've made the great breakthroughs, a lot of them physicists and mathematicians, consistently describe beauty as one of the guides to what it is that they're finding.
Yeah.
You might think that intelligence is largely dependent on this slightly boring accountant, as it were, the left hemisphere.
Yeah.
But it isn't. When people have strokes and damage to the brain, they got a series of 126 people who had a measurable drop in IQ following a brain injury or a stroke. And extraordinarily, almost all, when you overlap them, almost all the areas of interest, in fact, 96% are in the right hemisphere.
What about things like anxiety? It seems that there's an increasing number of people today that are living a faster paced life and a more online life and a more complex life. That was another thing I was thinking about, actually, that freedom of information. The freedom and instant access of information means that we can learn anything, or at least we can read anything at the touch of a button or screen.
Which is marvellous in many ways.
In many ways, but yet, where does true wisdom come from if it's all instantly accessible and then gone and forgotten in a second?
Well, yes, wisdom has nothing to do with the acquiring of information.
No, exactly. And
in fact, a lot of people in the great wisdom traditions and seriously important philosophers have said that wisdom has to do with stopping doing what you commonly mean by knowing things.
Yes, stopping that activity,
Yeah.
put the books away.
Exactly. I think there's a lot there in what you're asking. I mean, one of the difficulties is this linear thinking which depends on going for your target and getting things.
Yeah.
There's the measuring the left hemisphere likes to know how much of something there is.
Yeah.
It's not so interested in the quality of it, whereas the right
Okay.
hemisphere is appreciating the unique quality of something.
Yeah.
Whereas the left hemisphere is assessing how much of this have we got. And that's partly because in humans it has a particular function to do with language, but in most animals its main function is getting food.
Yeah.
Its main function is manipulating the environment, picking up things to build a shelter or a nest, but food.
Yeah.
And it's brilliant at that, because what it does is it knows what it's after, it spots it, it locks on to target, and it goes for it and gets it.
Yeah.
And it's the left hemisphere that controls your right hand, with which most of us do the grasping of things.
Yeah.
And it controls bits of language with which we say, oh, I've grasped that. So it's the one that helps us grab and grasp. And it's made us powerful and wealthy.
Yeah.
The trouble is that being powerful and wealthy hasn't made us happier.
Yeah.
And many of the things that we think are going to make us happy in the end don't. So the problem is partly the idea, if only I could have this, go there, do that, that would make me happy.
Yeah.
Rather than seeing that in fact it's about a disposition. It's not about a thing out there.
Yeah.
It's about a disposition in here. That is more comprehensible, if you like, to a right hemisphere take on the world,
Yeah.
which is interested in how we relate to things,
Yes.
not in what we can grasp.
Yeah.
Then you've got the problem that in a culture in which rivalry is exploited at the expense of cooperation, it increases enormously anger, aggression, and anxiety.
Yes.
We're all highly competitive, and there's a kind of view put about that actually that's how we intrinsically are.
Right, that's our nature.
That's our nature, that human nature is destructive, aggressive, competitive.
Yeah.
I would be wrong to deny that that impulse is there. It quite clearly is. But it's at least as strongly balanced, given half a chance, with something quite different, which is the capacity for empathy, cooperation, and not so much interest in what I can get here, but what we can do together for one another.
Yeah.
And of course, it's a cliche, but it's certainly true that what brings people happiness is not the having of things, but the being in connection with other people in the right way.
Yeah.
So our values are wrong, and they're promoted. They're fiercely being promoted by advertising and by ruthless policies of companies employing people to where it's always win-win and defeat and beat and all the rest. This attitude will finish us off very quickly. I mean, we've not got very long, in my view. I mean, it's certainly a matter of decades. It worries me because, like you, I have children.
Yeah.
And I now have grandchildren.
Yeah.
And what the world is going to be like for them, unless we can see quickly that we need not just to put a sticking plaster on, but think completely different.
Yes.
It's a change of heart. It's not just a different... You see, the left hemisphere says, OK, I get there's a problem. What's the fix? I'd like 8 bullet points, and then I'll do them, and then I'll go back to work, as I always do. And I'm saying, no, that will never, never work.
Yeah.
The only thing that will work for any of us, and for society it means a lot of us, shifting grossly our goals, our values, our thoughts about who we are, why we're here, and what we want for a society and a civilization.
Yeah.
Whether we can cause such an enormous change without catastrophe, I'm afraid I'm doubtful. I think that such a big change to happen so fast would require something I don't like even to contemplate, but life becoming so hard and so terrible because of the collapse of a civilization that we have to rethink. And I wish, hope and pray that we can see something before it's too late. it's not really that difficult. It's difficult because, and only because, we are stuck as we are. We like the way we are. And actually the left hemisphere is literally in various ways more stuck in its set. Once it gets onto something, it locks onto it. Remember, it's locking onto prey.
Yeah.
So it's got this thing, that's my object, that's my target, and it if you could just disengage it and go, but look, there's something else.
Yeah, to choose to do that. Could just choose to do that.
We can all choose to do that. Because we've all got it in here. I mean, the great thing is, our brains are much more balanced than this way of looking at the world is making us think they are.
Yeah.
We're being deprived, in fact, by what we're told. We're being deprived of the knowledge, the experience, and the understanding of a true fulfillment of the human potential in the mind and the brain.
Yes.
Instead, we're being palmed off, as I say. We're being sold a pup. We've been told, actually, we're just these ghastly, competitive, mechanical creatures. Soon robots will be better at doing things than we are, which is another, in my view, mistake. I mean, they'll be very good at doing all sorts of things, but they won't be very good at doing all the things that we really value about human life. And people say, well, how do you know that? Partly because we need a body, we need emotions, we need things that we don't even understand how they work or where they come from. In order to experience those things. We're not just computers. We're nothing like computers.
Yes. So what might we do then in any sphere of influence we have, whether it's a group or a company or a government, in terms of asking the right question about that change?
I mean, you, of course, were asking a very difficult question to which I don't have an immediate answer. Partly, we all have to, in a famous phrase, be the change we desire to see. So I don't want, although I do feel it's a difficult battle because of the way we're stuck where we are, not because we haven't got the capacity to change, but because we tend to get stuck on what we like here and now. We can change, and I don't want to overwhelm people by saying it can't be done. And if we all actually individually made it our business to think hard about what our values are and how we express them, and what that means for our life and how we might live differently, we'd probably have accomplished it. And one of the things that would help, or one of the things that doesn't help in its absence, is nature. One of the reasons I live in one of the very last relatively wild, beautiful places left in Britain is that you feel an immediate contact with something which is palpable here. Most visitors who come here comment on it. They say they can feel something, which again is implicit, it's hard to articulate, but they feel it very strongly, of a sense that their relationship to the world alters when they're here. They actually think differently about things, they see things differently. When you're in a natural setting, you actually see that you are literally part of this world, this nature. Nature isn't a thing out there that is studied in nature classes, or you go out and do, or you control and manage. You know, the environment, such a dastardly word. The environment, it suggests it's something around you that isn't you. It should be banned. The word is nature, and it used to be Mother Nature. Nature is feminine. It is the principle, I think, a sacred principle in the world. And, you know, people can laugh and say, oh, you can't prove. Well, of course you can't prove it. There are many good things in life that you can't prove. If you've ever been in love, prove to me that you were. There are many things one can see that it's hard to prove, but they're not irrational. They are what I would call transrational. In other words, reason doesn't deal with them. That's not a problem, because if you get it right, you know that reason is incredibly valuable. It will take you so far but no further. Intuition is very valuable, but it's not to be trusted just like that. And I always say people who reason well have better intuitions than those who don't. And people who have good practice of respecting intuitions, use reason better.
Yeah.
So that's a marriage again, it's a harmony that we need to have.
Yeah.
So if we could get that back, and one of the things might be to try to spend more time actually, there are parks in big towns, thank God, for most people. There are places you can go where you can go and walk in nature. And we know from medical research, this is a fashionable topic now, that this actually does enormously improve not just people's levels of anxiety and depression, which it very clearly does, but has, over longer periods, improvements on things like blood pressure, cancer rates, and so forth.
Yeah.
I mean, all of that is, at the moment, at a somewhat speculative stage, but it certainly has beneficial effects on the way we think.
Yeah. So there's the health benefit that's clearly there. There's the inspiration that comes from being in these kind of places.
Yeah.
And then there's the removal of the blocks. It sounds like, in a way, is what you're describing. If people can come here and sit or stand in this landscape and think, I can feel something.
Yes.
Is that a removal or a losing of the shroud that's over us the rest of the time? Is it just that we're able to see more clearly because of that, do you think?
Well, I think that image of a veil or a shroud, as you say, is a rather good one. In a way, things are very quickly taken by what I would call the practices of the left hemisphere, which wants to categorize, pigeonhole things so that it understands where to put them, and to string them together according to certain principles. What it is doing is sort of managing things, but it's making them no longer really present to us. It represents the world, and that word is fantastic, because if you just think about it, what it means is it's no longer present to you.
Yes.
It has been made present to you artificially, again, after the event.
Yes.
Now, if we live in a world that is constantly represented on a screen, wherever it might be, and it doesn't have to be on a screen, we're representing reality all the time to ourselves.
Yeah.
We're going, oh, it's one of those.
Yeah.
But if we could get back to the freshness of experience, which is what many of the meditation techniques, mindfulness, and the principles of Oriental wisdom are about, being present, it's a shattering experience, because the world becomes alive again, and becomes marvelous again, and is no longer stressing and pressuring you. You no longer feel, I haven't got time, I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't do anything. Because your mind is being tormented by being asked to attend to far too many things.
Yes.
And if you can stop that, and it may require a bit of discipline about how you use technology, not being at the beck and call of it, then that is at least a good start.
Yeah.
There's a great book called The Winter of Our Disconnect by Susan Mouseheart.
Yeah.
And it's not only a very entertaining and well-written book, but the story is that she, with great opposition from the family, decided that they were going to spend 6 months, just a trial, to see what it was like, and they were all going to go offline.
Yeah.
And at the end of the period, to cut a long story short, her children, who'd complained so badly about it, said, oh, we don't want to go back to the way it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because what happened was that instead of somebody coming into a room and saying sort of, dinner's ready, and they're going, I'm busy, sort of, and not doing anything really communally, they started to do all kinds of things that they used to do but they've forgotten about.
Yeah.
And they made music together, and they laughed, and they just did stuff.
Yes.
And went out and looked at things.
Yeah.
And they found that it was revivifying.
Yeah.
So, some people may say, well, it wouldn't work for me. Maybe, I don't know. But it's worth a try.
Yeah.
And certainly just not being so dependent on one of the things about being here is I can't get a mobile signal.
Yeah.
But even when I'm away, I don't give people my number because I never put the thing on. I only have it for an emergency. If I'm in a stuck situation, then, good, I can phone. But not being at that constant, what is it that we say in Britain? People look at their phone every 3 minutes or something. So luckily one can be without that. One can just say, I'm not going to do that.
Yes.
and it doesn't necessarily make you any less efficient.
Yeah.
In fact, it might make you much more efficient.
Yeah, so a simple thing that anyone can actually do, and again, the choice to say, oh, I'll do that, I'll try that.
Yes.
So that might be one.
Well, I think that's one. I think education is very important.
Yes.
I don't want to sound like Tony Blair, but what you said was undisputedly true.
Yeah.
Education is very important.
Yeah.
And how we train people is the way we create the society of the future.
Yeah.
And one thing I feel very sad about is that now, compared with when I was at school, so much of it is tramlined. The great thing I remember at school was that there was a lot of freedom for teachers to teach about what interested them. And most of the classes were discussions. They weren't sort of one way.
Right.
And mind you, it might be harder nowadays because people haven't learnt the discipline of sitting still and attending. And there might be more problems with actually controlling that situation so that actually fruitful conversation can occur.
Yeah.
But that's got to happen.
Yeah.
And, you know, the worst thing you can possibly do, I mean, going back to something I was involved in, teaching literature, the worst thing you could possibly do is have a sort of situation where people believe there are, you know, 6 important things to say about George Eliot, and you've got to get them into your essay.
Yeah.
It discourages original thinking, which seems to me a rather important thing.
Yes.
And of course, it also substitutes information for true knowledge and understanding.
So again, back to retaining information rather than wisdom.
And information is pieces of stuff.
And this is obviously a real preoccupation of you at the moment, the stuff. And things.
The things.
So this must be something that's in your mind all the time at the moment as you're working on a new book.
Well, yes, it is. I'm writing a book at the moment which is... I'm going to one day find out how to sum it up quickly. But basically what I'm interested in is getting the focus away from things and objects to relationships. A simple, I think, comprehensible example is music.
Yeah.
Music could be thought of as a thing in a way.
Yeah.
But what is that thing? Let's inspect it. Indeed, let's analyse it in order to find out what it's made of and how it works.
Yeah.
Perfect left brain stuff.
Yeah.
Well, it's got notes. What are notes? There's sounds of a certain pitch, but they don't mean anything at all. Let's try taking 2 of them. Well, neither of them means anything. You can add hundreds of things that don't mean anything. They're not going to mean anything. So is it somewhere else? Maybe it's in the gaps between the notes that makes the harmony, or the notes that make the melody, or whatever. But those gaps are just where nothing is happening.
Yeah.
And yet, this combination of those points with the gaps between them creates a completely new whole. An experience that can move you to tears.
Yeah.
And can mean so much. Far from having no meaning, it means enormously. And one of the problems is that because we don't think that relationship is how we understand things and understand meaning, we're being told by people who only look at things that there is no meaning in the world.
Yeah.
I don't experience that.
Yeah.
Don't ask me to say what that meaning is any more than to tell you when I say my partner means so much to me.
Yeah.
What does she mean? Now, you don't expect me to answer that question.
No.
And you don't expect me to answer when I say Mozart's G minor quintet, means everything,
Yeah.
And you say, well, can you explain what it means to me? Well, of course I can't. And the same thing is true about life. That if you look at it in this, break it up into bits and try and find out where the stuff is, you'll find it means precisely nothing.
Yeah.
But if you see that it actually is a fantastically complex, incredibly beautiful, constantly changing, self-organizing, rather like sort of a choreographed piece of music, then you see what the meaning is. So this may sound very new agey and so forth. So what I'm doing is actually starting from the basics. Let's look at what science can tell us, because I am a scientist. I believe powerfully in in the imaginative grasp of good science,
Yeah.
and in what science can do to make our lives so much richer.
Yeah.
But it can't answer all our questions, but it can answer a lot of very good ones.
Yeah.
Let's look at reason, what it can do. And again, I'm a great believer in reason. I'm a great believer in being as clear as you can, but no clearer.
Yeah.
Trying to be clearer than you can about something that's intrinsically not that kind of a thing will just make you fail to understand it.
Yeah.
And I'm a great believer in what one can argue rationally. In fact, my books are all full of that.
Yeah.
But it has its limitations.
Yeah.
What is intuition? Well, again, sometimes it can be enormously informative and tells us things that other ways of finding out can't give us. But it can also, of course, be completely wrong.
Yeah.
So it's knowing how to discriminate and how to use them together.
Yeah.
And if you adopt these approaches, you find that the world begins to look very much like what the right hemisphere sees it to be, which is a combination of things in which all the stuff that the left hemisphere does has its place.
Yeah.
It is, in Einstein's expression, it is doing its job as a faithful servant.
Yes.
But it should never be the master.
Yes.
And that is the only problem we have. Nothing wrong with the left hemisphere, it's just making it into the master that is the pathology.
Yes.
And that's where we're at. So we only need to start paying attention again to all the things that we've been told it's not smart to believe.
Yes.
And not smart to give any kind of intellectual time or attention to.
Yeah.
There should be more emphasis, I think, on the arts, not through some dreary statistical survey of how many people have got through the doors of something, because often that means actually substituting something rather meretricious that will get your numbers up for what is seriously interesting.
Yeah.
You have to accept that sometimes you're going to do something that makes people think and go, not sure if I like that, but gosh, it's interesting.
Yeah.
And come back for some more.
Yeah, yeah.
So our business of sort of chasing figures and, let's get away from that and try and really engage with the power of literature, of drama, of music and so forth at school and in our lives. Not just as, sometimes I get the impression from talking to sort of clever people who are doing terribly well in London that the real business of life is what they do when they're sitting in a very boring office under strip lighting, fiddling with numbers.
Yeah.
And then they come home all exhausted, having at least done proper work. And then they get entertained by going to the theatre or the opera or something.
Yeah.
And this is completely back to front, because those entertainments are the things that are actually telling you things about life, enriching your life.
Yeah.
Whereas the stuff you're doing in the day is not enriching yours or anybody else's life, if you're honest.
Yeah.
It may be enriching you in the sense of pouring figures into your bank account.
Yeah.
But is that going to make you happier?
Yeah, yeah.
And I know it would be lovely to say it does, but all the evidence is it doesn't.
Yeah, and back to what you said before, the importance of nature, because as you were describing all of these things, I'm also thinking about that and us in it. The way you describe music and the way that the landscape looks here outside your home. They're
very similar.
Yes, they can create the same emotion or they can create the same inspiration.
Well, all of those things help to take us beyond our normal, restricted set of ways of thinking.
Yes.
And that is really what their value is. They put us in touch with something that is other than us, that is beyond us and beyond the very limited set of things that we can know and believe by just doing the normal things we do.
Yes.
And the trouble is that somehow it's got around that if you're clever, in other words, very left hemisphere, and actually less intelligent and less insightful, you don't even think about those things because they're not really real.
Yeah.
But actually, all those things, if you attend to them, are speaking to you about things that I think are very real and very important, and indeed are not in any way in conflict, actually, with science. The biological sciences have got a bit stuck in a time warp. They're still very much enthralled to basically a 19th century mechanical world picture, which physics dropped over a century ago.
Yeah.
And in physics, we're beginning to see that everything is in relationship. that actually this very hard substance there's hardly anything there. There are things that are relating to one another, doing something very much like, as I was saying, a sort of choreographed a piece of music. In fact, the images are often used by physicists as well as by Buddhists.
Yes.
But these points do come very close. And there's a sort of message that's often put about, people talk like that, but of course no real physicist actually would countenance that there's any real coming together of that kind of a philosophical outlook and what we really know from modern physics. That is not true. I can give 30 to 40 examples of absolutely top physicists who would not throw their hands up in despair.
Yeah.
There's quite an interesting, just tell you a very little anecdote. 3 or 4 years ago, I gave the Vice-Chancellor's lecture at a British university. And because it was a named lecture, I thought I'll do what I don't normally do, which is write it down. I normally speak off the cuff.
Yeah.
So I'd got my text, and I arrived early, was invited by the Vice-Chancellor to have a cup of tea. And he introduced himself and said, "I'm a physicist." And I thought, oh, Lord, because he said, "But I loved your book," which actually a lot of physicists have written to me to say they find it particularly fascinating, which I didn't anticipate. But in any case, I thought, oh, gosh, because in the text I'd written down, I said at one point, the right hemisphere creates a world in which it's almost like Schrödinger's cat doesn't have to be ever alive or dead.
Yeah.
But the left hemisphere is the world in which it has to collapse into being alive or dead.
Yeah.
And the Vice-Chancellor said, "I really enjoyed your book." And I was thinking about it. And I think you could almost say that the right hemisphere's world is like the one in which Schrödinger's cat doesn't have to be alive or dead. And the left hemisphere is the one in which it has to collapse into being one or the other. And I thought, phew. And so I went ahead and said it at the lecture.
Yeah.
And said, and by the way, I have that on the authority of your physicist Vice-Chancellor.
So a huge round of applause, I should imagine.
So it was a very nice moment of validation.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a serious point there, which is that, the point about the observer effect on a wave, that it then becomes particulate.
Yes.
That in putting a certain kind of attention onto the phenomenon, we actually change it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that thing, that a wave is less determinate.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily in that point or not in that point.
Yes.
But once it's been observed, it then has to be located in that point.
Yeah, which again, that's our involvement in everything, not separate to it.
Not separate and outside of it.
Yes.
But actually partaking of it.
Yes.
So the universe out there has you and me and our world in it.
Yeah.
And we have bits of it in us too.
Yes.
It's a seamless structure.
Yeah.
There are nodes, if you like, in it, which are what we call things.
Yes.
Things are particularly obvious little hard nuggets of this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's all a relative matter.
Yes.
Matter is a relative matter.
Yeah, well, that seems like the perfect place to end. I think it sums up. I think it sums up in a way, at least, everything we've just been talking about. So, thank you very much, Ian.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.